Honourable members, I have received correspondence from the member for Arnhem as follows. I propose for discussion this day the following definite matter of public importance. Domestic, family and sexual violence is claiming the lives of too many Northern Territory women and tearing families apart. We need a strong bipartisan approach to address it. The letter is signed by the member for Arnhem. Is discussion supported?
Yes.
It must be supported by 4 members standing, please. Thank you. Speakers. Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Too many Territory women and children live under the shadow of violence and abuse perpetrated by a close family member or an intimate partner. Every year, too many Territory families are forced to bury a loved one who has lost their life to domestic, family or sexual violence. The statistics make for an incredibly distressing read, but more than just reading, Madam Speaker, often stories of people that we know in our community or indeed are related to. Since the year 2000, at least 90 women in the Territory have been killed as a result of domestic violence. That includes 11 women killed in horrific circumstances since June this year, in the space of just a few months. Countless more have ended up in hospital, Madam Speaker. More again, countless more Territory women have endured violence and abuse within the confines of their own home without ever reporting it. Madam Speaker, domestic, family and sexual violence across the Territory is a whole of community issue that impacts people of all ages, from all cultures, ethnic groups, socio-economic backgrounds, languages, religions and sexuality. Madam Speaker, here in the Territory, unfortunately, this high statistic disproportionately affects and impacts Aboriginal women and children in our community. A terrible byproduct of poverty, disadvantage, overcrowded housing, substance abuse, and the myriad of other social and economic challenges faced by our communities. Madam Speaker, 90% of women who have lost their life to domestic violence here in the Territory, that's 9 out of 10 Territory women, are Aboriginal women. This is horrifying. Almost half of women in the Territory, 46%, Madam Speaker, have experienced physical and or sexual violence since the age of 15 years old. 1 in 3 women have experienced violence, emotional abuse or economic abuse by a live-in partner. Again, Madam Speaker, a vast majority of these women are Aboriginal Territorians. Putting these figures into a broader context, partner homicide in the Northern Territory is 7 times the national average. An endemic, a scourge and a crisis. There have been many labels put on this tragic situation, and they are all fitting descriptions. It is, Madam Speaker, without a doubt, one of the most urgent issues facing the Northern Territory right now, and one that I ask that the Parliament unite on. Madam Speaker, last week was a dark time for many Territorians. There was passage of regressive and punitive legislation by the CLP government that will see more children, including children as young as 10, locked away in our prison system. And I know that the community's had enough of children and young people engaging in criminal activity and they want to see consequences. But I also know, Madam Speaker, that many families have had their houses and cars broken into and their privacy violated. But even the CLP last week, Madam Speaker, acknowledged during debate last week that youth offending doesn't happen in a vacuum. Often those young people who are engaging in criminal and antisocial behaviour have been raised in households, or maybe they don't have a house, where domestic and family violence is an everyday occurrence in their lives. Home is not necessarily a safe place for some of these kids to be in, which pushes them into the child protection or youth justice system. And it is very important that we establish the strong links between domestic violence and youth offending, Madam Speaker, because if we are truly serious in this Parliament about improving community safety and reducing the rates of crime across our communities, then we must maintain a focus on tackling domestic, family and sexual violence in the Territory in order to build a safe home for all and a strong community for everybody. Madam Speaker, we cannot afford to dismiss it as something that only impacts those immediately involved. This is simply not the case. The ripple effects of domestic violence are felt through our whole Territory community. Madam Speaker, reducing domestic violence is an issue that requires a concerted, bipartisan approach. This is what this motion is about today, the matter of public importance. Madam Speaker, our Territory Labor opposition wants to see all of the CLP government and the crossbench working together when it comes to tackling and addressing family, domestic and sexual violence, when it comes to ensuring that we have strong police, strong schools, strong community sectors and strong Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, strong traditional owners and strong families working together to turn the tide on what is a life and death matter for many Territory women. Madam Speaker, our Labor opposition strongly urge the CLP government to fast-track the rollout of Labor's $180 million additional investment, which the CLP also committed to delivering on, and putting this money into directly the frontline specialist services that need them. Madam Speaker, we put our hand on heart as the Labor opposition to say we will do everything we can to support this rollout, but it must be done urgently. We also ask the CLP government to accept our offer of bipartisan support to place this on the record today and for the next 4 years to ensure that we all advocate for Commonwealth funding that is needs-based to combat truly what we are seeing in domestic, family and sexual violence across the Territory. We did this for 8 years as a Labor government and we will continue to do this for the next 4 years as a Labor opposition. And I'm sure members of the crossbench will be happy to join in this collective approach, should they choose to represent and be bipartisan on all accounts for such a critical matter, one that truly transcends any such political differences we may have here in this House. Madam Speaker, we know what we've seen so far through the CLP government has a narrow focus on only punitive measures and consequences in terms of response when it comes to community safety. We offer this as an opportunity now to tell the public how we will bind together to ensure that our future laws and legislation that will be passed in the Northern Territory Parliament will be aimed at reducing crime and preventing crime, including that very important area and the critical crisis area of family, domestic and sexual violence across the Territory. Madam Speaker, punitive measures are important and we know that they can be a deterrent, not always, but they can be when it comes to community safety. But they cannot be the whole story. So we implore the government to ensure they are going through their new role with open eyes and an open heart to truly tackle those causes of crime in our community, particularly to ensure that we focus on our victims and our survivor victims with family, domestic and sexual violence. We want to ensure that there is early prevention and intervention and rehabilitation measures in this sector. And we know our experts in the family domestic violence sector are calling for this and have been for many, many years. We know that around half the men in the Territory prisons, Madam Speaker, are there as a result of domestic violence offences. It is also distressing that the stark statistic in the sorry domestic violence story that we see across the Territory, but we believe together it is one that we can turn around. Madam Speaker, violence against women is preventable, but only if we all work together. Our former Territory Labor government laid the foundation for a strong and sustainable response to domestic, family and sexual violence prevention here in the Northern Territory. And it won't be fixed over 8 years, 4 years, or indeed the next 10, but it can start now with the new government's willingness to work together to ensure that what has been already laid continues to be a strong path for all of us in this place. From coming to government in 2016 until the August 2024 election, Madam Speaker, Territory Labor invested over $250 million into preventing and responding to family, domestic and sexual violence in the Northern Territory. The annual investment grew from $17 million from 2016 to $70 million in budget 2024, with a commitment to continue to increasing funding to better respond to the unfortunate need across our communities. This investment, Madam Speaker, has and continues to support important initiatives in health, justice, policing, corrections, men's behaviour change, and in reducing the impacts of violence on victim survivors, including our Territory kids. Madam Speaker, the former Labor government's investment was underpinned by a number of important evidence-based strategies that we strongly urge the CLP to continue with, and we will support you to do so. The 10-year Safe, Respected and Free from Violence Reduction Framework and allied action plans underpin and coordinate the efforts of government bodies, non-government organisations and community stakeholders until 2028. It offers a shared vision for keeping women and children safe and supporting our Territory families to be strong. The strategy articulates that turning the tide on domestic, family and sexual violence in the Territory will take a concerted and sustained long-term effort, Madam Speaker, through the shared responsibility and through partnerships. Territory Labor has asked the then Opposition Leader, Madam Speaker, the now Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, to ensure that we continue to work together on this critical issue. And we've only seen one public statement on this by the Chief Minister, and we welcome many more. On behalf of Territory Labor opposition, Madam Speaker, I want to place on the record that we will walk next to the Chief Minister hand in hand with the CLP government every step of the way to Canberra and back if we need to ensure that our frontline services here in the Territory have everything they need to continue the work to combat this terrible scourge. We cannot afford to shift our focus from this crisis, Madam Speaker. We need to stay strong and work together until Territory women and Territory kids are safe from violence. Madam Speaker, Territory Labor rolled out the Action Plan 1 and 2 under the Safe, Respected and Free from Violence framework, which was backed up with a critical investment. The Family Safety Framework was a key initiative out of Action Plan 1, which included an evidence-based risk assessment process, better support for victim survivors and ongoing funding for specialist domestic, family and sexual violence court in Alice Springs. And we've seen some of the success there, Madam Speaker, in your hometown. This was an important step in providing safer, less traumatic court experience for victim survivors of domestic violence and also their family members who have now had their own entrance and waiting area in the court, so they do not come face to face with the alleged perpetrators in their lives. The courtroom, Madam Speaker, as you would know, is also set up so they cannot be seen or heard by the defendant, causing perhaps further trauma in that experience. At the time, Larissa Ellis, the CEO of the Women's Safety Services of Central Australia, said, and I quote, "The new facilities will provide a significant improvement in the court experience for survivors and victims of family violence and will hopefully empower more vulnerable victims to follow matters through to the courts," end quote. Madam Speaker, that was one of a number of key initiatives that were implemented under Action Plan 1. Another was the release of the dedicated Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Framework. The strategy provides dedicated focus on combating significant harm, that is sexual violence, which often goes hand in hand, unfortunately, with physical assault and abuse, but remains largely underreported in our community. Madam Speaker, I talked earlier about CLP's narrow punitive-based approach to community safety, and it's disappointing to have only taken a narrow approach to this issue as well, when we see that the appointment of the Minister and their government is for the prevention of domestic violence, leaving out any reference to family or sexual violence. This fails to recognise the full extent and the weight of what is being experienced and the impact of violence on families, but particularly children and young people and women in our everyday community. Our former Labor government released a second action plan, Madam Speaker, in August 2023, building on the progress towards generational change and safer communities. A new domestic family sexual violence co-respondent model was introduced in Alice Springs, and something the sector that had been calling for. This model, Madam Speaker, sees police and victim survivors, support organisations responding to domestic family sexual violence incidents in a partnership arrangements to ensure an appropriate and effective response. Action Plan 2 also saw the establishment of an Aboriginal-led DVSV Prevention Initiative Fund, Madam Speaker, which expanded domestic and family violence programs in prisons and invested in counselling services for women in custody. Men's behaviour change programs in the community were expanded, and the specialist DFSV court in Alice Springs was strengthened, including additional legal supports. It also included strengthened support for special services for child victim survivors. Importantly, each initiative implemented under the Safe, Respected and Free from Violence framework had been informed by data analysis, research, consultation and expert advice from across the DFSV sector. It is worth putting on the record, Madam Speaker, that an expert is someone with broad competence, knowledge and skills acquired through research, education, experience and practice in the particular field. When it comes to understanding and responding to domestic, family and sexual violence, and in fact any complex social or economic challenge in the Territory, our Territory Labor opposition will always listen to and take guidance from subject matter experts, because we know these people who've dedicated, in many cases, their lives to researching and understanding a particular issue and offering their expertise and for solutions. When this knowledge is applied, Madam Speaker, to policies, programs, regulations and initiatives, we know we are going to get better informed, targeted and effective outcomes for the benefit of all of the communities that we represent. Madam Speaker, Amplifying the Voices program is one of the programs that our former Labor government invested in, co-designed by women who have lived experiences of domestic, family and sexual violence in our communities and working alongside experts in the field. It is a training program, Madam Speaker, that prepares victim survivors to become advocates, exercising their lived experience to help influence system reform, so services, programs and policies from government and service sectors better reflect the needs and experience of victim survivors. For too long, domestic violence was a taboo subject. Victim survivors were largely voiceless. If we are to stem the prevalence of domestic violence in our community, it is so important that victim survivors are given a strong voice and are empowered to speak up and to speak out through these programs such as this. We need to allow the light to shine on the darkest corners of our community, Madam Speaker, if we are to fully address domestic violence across our community. Madam Speaker, yesterday I met with the Chief Executive Officer of Guyula Aboriginal Corporation, Mr Steve Smith. Guyula are the representatives of the TO group in Barunga and Woogala community in the Arnhem electorate. They have won an extensive and very resource grant to focus on community-led men's wellness centres programs. The programs were aimed to address the range of complex issues that are facing men in those communities in a culturally responsive and holistic way, including mental health concerns, substance abuse, family violence and cultural disconnection. Guyula has received the funding of $4.4 million to embed this program over the next 3 years. They will deliver cultural healing and social programs on country, healing events, workshops, substance abuse workshops and family violence prevention and mentorship programs. It is these programs, Madam Speaker, that will ensure that across the Territory we see more Aboriginal organisations taking on that responsibility to better support mental, emotional, cultural wellbeing for men in the community, strengthening community and cultural ties, developing leadership skills and reducing the rates of substance abuse and family violence. Madam Speaker, if we are truly to reduce the rates of family, domestic and sexual violence in the community, we need to all do our bit. Community-driven programs are implemented within local cultural contexts, like the one that Guyula is putting in place, to play an incredibly critical and important role in turning behaviour around and supporting stronger communities and stronger families by setting clear standards of what is acceptable behaviour. Madam Speaker, as I've outlined today, during the government's time in power, it has continued to increase in the focus on the investment in domestic, family and sexual violence. We need to do this in a concerted effort, a close partnership to ensure our frontline services delivering those programs, whether they're Aboriginal organisations or non-Aboriginal organisations, all of our community-controlled organisations, the legal sector, our victim survivors and other community members need to ensure that initiatives are evidence-based and responded to in a way that our communities deserve. Madam Speaker, the fight for needs-based funding continues and is as urgent as ever. When we need the leadership from Chief Minister Leah Finocchiaro, we will continue to support and advocate for, when she attends National Cabinet in Canberra or wherever across the country, that we, our united Northern Territory, we will continue to address family, domestic and sexual violence.
Member for Mulcair.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for bringing this MPI to the Chamber today. This is a very important issue. I'd like to extend my condolence to those families who have experienced loss at the hands of a perpetrator of family violence. I'd also like to extend my sympathy to those who are survivors of violence and those who are currently surviving violence. We must fix this issue for all of you and encourage everyone to stand strongly against violence. And if you know someone is being harmed, then speak out. We must stand strong to intervene and protect those who are in need, who need it. We must do our job as leaders to protect our communities. Madam Speaker, I will speak about the Guyula Women's Space. This was a community-led project that many strong elders in Guyula have supported and worked hard to achieve. I'd like to acknowledge my gurung Bettina Danganbar, who was part of fighting for safe space for women and children in Guyula. She was awarded with an Order of Australia medal earlier this year. Sadly, the infrastructure that government provided for the women's space has considerable problems because the contractors repurposed old dongas that already considerably maintain on the maintenance. What am I talking? Yes. On the maintenance. I believe there are still roof leaks among the problems and other problems. But apart from these problems, it is important that there is a women's space that has ownership by Yolngu women, leaders of our community that is underpinned by Yolngu indigenous culture and law. In this same way, there is a need for men's space and resource to run programs for young men so that male elders can run programs for young men in our communities to address the issues of building respectful relationships and teaching young men about how to behave and become strong family men, and also strong community leaders. In the 13th Assembly, Minister Wakefield came to Guyula and met with community members about having both women and men's space. This is appropriate for Yolngu communities. We often have men and women's space where our elders hold authority in the space and work to manage and lead our communities. This is the main message that I bring. We must have a strong bipartisan approach to deal with issues of domestic, family and sexual violence. But more importantly, we must work in partnership with our First Nations people. All members of this House, the government and opposition, the crossbench and all organisations must work with the elders and leaders for the First Nations communities if we are going to have successful outcomes. It must be community-led solutions that drive the change. We must see resources that empower our people to bring programs that are culturally appropriate and draw on our cultural strength. Just to be clear, family violence is not part of, say that again, family violence is not lawful according to our law. The Yolngu Rom, our way and our laws does not condone violence. There are clear laws about and around looking after family that are in step with the Balanda laws. But to get the most successful outcomes, resourcing community-led solutions and resourcing those organisations who are directed by our leaders and elders will be critical to bringing change. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Guyula.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to acknowledge the members who have contributed to the debate so far. I think it's an important discussion to have before the Assembly because we know that domestic, family and sexual violence is affecting our communities in each and every corner of the Northern Territory, but also each and every corner of the nation. And, Madam Speaker, it is domestic violence is insidious. It is a condition, it's an epidemic that is tearing families apart, that is tearing communities apart, and that is causing great unrest and great conflict across the Northern Territory. Now, I'm not here to say who should have done what or what should be done or what didn't get done, but I'm here tonight to say that this is an Assembly who I genuinely acknowledge that everyone who has contributed last week and will probably contribute tonight has a genuine passion and commitment to change the Northern Territory and to overcome the challenges that many of our own families face in the domestic and family violence space. It's a very hard section of our community when we talk about the reform work that needs to be done. And I think we acknowledge that there's been initiatives that have been delivered over a period of time. The DV Specialist Court in Alice Springs, a really fantastic initiative. The men's behavioural change programs that roll out across the Northern Territory, delivered by organisations like Tungandura, Family Safety Group in Alice Springs, and also Catholic Care in the top end. These are really important programs and projects. Madam Speaker, I also want to acknowledge the incredible work of what was then called the ICRO, and that was I can't think now, it was the coordinated response of government to come together to look at what it would take to help address domestic and family violence in the Northern Territory. And it was a pretty incredible piece of work. And I just think it's really important tonight to acknowledge all of those department officials who came from various departments, Territory Families, Attorney Generals, Chief Mins, Police, who all came together to work through and look at the important work that needed to be done, and that certainly paved a way for the future around understanding some of the costs. Needs-based funding is by far the biggest matter that we need to overcome here in the Northern Territory, and I think it's incredibly important that we stick together as a parliament to address and call for needs-based funding. And I said in this chamber last week, Madam Speaker, that I'm absolutely prepared to jump on an aeroplane with the Chief Minister in a true mark of bipartisanship and march the halls in Canberra, knocking on the doors and talking to anyone that will listen to us around the need for needs-based funding here in the Northern Territory. Because I think this Parliament, the 15th Parliament, has a really exciting opportunity right now to work together and put this matter above politics. And I genuinely feel that we can do this. Leave and remove myself from a toxic relationship where I feel disempowered, I feel unable to play a role in shaping my future and my destiny. There will be an increase, and we need to be very clear with Canberra that needs-based funding will increase the stats because people are actually comfortable about coming out, seeking support, seeking assistance. Madam Speaker, it's so important that we acknowledge that. There's also great organisations across the Territory, and I've spoken about them in general. But, you know, we have a problem in this country when our own DV activists are killed by their partners. And I want to acknowledge my really good friend, Kumajay Rabunja, who was killed by her own partner at the front of the Alice Springs Hospital. And she had reached out for help so many times, and she was ignored. Not ignored by one agency, but ignored by multiple agencies. There is a problem. And I'm not going to blame anyone tonight, because there is a problem with the system. And we all need to work together to change the system. And that is above politics. And absolutely, I commend the Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, around the $180 million commitment. I think it's a fantastic step forward. I think that the money absolutely needs to make sure that it is at the front line. It's addressing women's shelters, it's providing all that support. Because when we think about, we are talking about this as a matter of public importance right now, and we have already lost 7 women in the Northern Territory to domestic and family violence. My own cousin was the 7th person from Lajamanu who lost her life, again, to her own partner. And now my family have to tell my little families that they don't have a mum. They don't have an auntie or a grandmother or a cousin. As we talk about this matter of public importance, there are 2 women in the ICU here at the Royal Darwin Hospital. There is another woman in the ICU in Adelaide because of domestic family violence. When is it going to stop? The only way it is going to stop is by this Assembly coming together and by calling for needs-based funding and for improving services and conditions the safe houses in remote communities, women's shelters, crisis accommodation, behavioural change programs. That's how we change. That's how we get people on the straight and narrow. There are people who think it's weak to call out domestic and family violence. There are people who think that you are less of a man if you stand with people to call out domestic and family violence. It is not. You are more of a man when you stand up and call out domestic and family violence. You are more of a worthy person when you stand with important movements and call that out. And Madam Speaker, I am a proud Aboriginal person. I know my culture, I know our law, and I absolutely respect it. Domestic and family violence has no role in Aboriginal culture. Never has, never will. There are elements of our culture that seem brutal, and they are brutal. We inflict pain when we lose a loved one sometimes to help as part of the grieving process and a mark of respect. But domestic and family violence and abuse on women and children has no place in Aboriginal culture and never does. There is absolutely work around how we empower our families to take control of their lives, and that's done through support. It's also done through positive relationships, and men's behavioural change is absolutely incredible. Campaigns like The Boys Can, Girls Can around establishing positive relationships is a really important step, because we have to break down gender norms, because as a country we have to come to terms with we have developed quite a rough and brutal attitude, and we need to dismantle that. We need to honour and respect our women and our children, and we need to provide a world where they can live free from violence, where they can feel empowered to live their best lives. And that is the role of each and every one of us. We also need to call out people who stand up at No More rallies when they have a history of domestic and family violence themselves. We have to, and I'm going to borrow the words from the member for Drysdale, this Parliament, we all have to have the courage to call bad behaviour out when we see it. Because if people are standing there and we know that they have a history, and we know that they haven't been in any program to address that behaviour, to address that attitude, to change, then we all have an important role to say, hey, that's not okay. That's not to dismiss people who have gone through the program. There are amazing people in Central Australia, my home, and I've seen firsthand people who were part of the domestic and family violence men's behaviour change program, finishing and still continuing, driving in over 200 Ks every week to participate in the men's behavioural change, to support other men to stand strong and to change their behaviours and to change their attitudes. It is really incredibly important, and that is just so heartening to see. I think we have to get over this as well. I'm not an abuser, and it's not all men. No one has ever said it is all men, but we're saying that it most times is men who are doing it to a wife, a girlfriend, a mother, a daughter, a cousin, an auntie, or just women in general. And we have to call that behaviour out, and it's important. There are amazing campaigns that we should all be getting behind and supporting. It's incredible. This Parliament has done some really important law reform over many years. Contemporising the domestic and family violence legislation is really important. And I really stand here tonight saying and recommitting that where there is good legislation that protects the victims and the victim survivors of domestic and family violence, I will absolutely support, because it is incredibly important that people in our community are protected and are supported. Because we've seen firsthand the implications that this happens on our families. So again, Madam Speaker, I certainly leave the offer there that I am willing to do whatever it takes, even move motions or a remonstrance of the Parliament to Canberra to call on needs-based funding for this very, very important matter here that we are discussing tonight, because domestic and family violence has no place in the Northern Territory, has no place in the country, and we all need to continue to stand together to address this. And I think it's important as well. I need to be mindful. I've got to learn. I've got to do better. Our language matters. It's really important. We shouldn't be saying we're fighting against it. We're not tackling it. We need to be overcoming it. We need to not be using aggressive language when we're talking about domestic and family violence, because for some people that can be quite alarming. It can be upsetting, and it can lead to people reliving their trauma. And that's the last thing I want to ever be a part of. So, Madam Speaker, I think that we're all here to do good, and we will do good, and this is an important issue, and I commend it to coming to the Assembly.
Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to start, before I speak, I'd like to ask the Chamber if we could have a minute's silence for the women who have been killed in the Territory, and since June we've heard there's been 7 women killed. Can I ask?
Is it supported? Does the Chamber support this?
I'd like to start with that. Thank you.
Please be seated.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam
Continue
Speaker.
your comments. Member for Johnston.
In Jewish culture, when someone dies, we say every life is a universe, and we say to the survivors, we wish you long life. I cannot imagine the pain of having someone you love, your sister, your mother, your daughter, your friend, killed by the man who's supposed to be the one who loves her the most. And I can hardly comprehend the size of this problem nationally, where one woman is killed every 4 to 5 days. But as we've heard, and we know that here in the NT, it's even worse. 7 women have been killed in June, and 3 women are in intensive care. That's 7 universes. And the domestic homicide rate in the Northern Territory is 7 times higher than the national average, and we know that the majority of these women are Aboriginal women. So I want to acknowledge the women who've been killed, and I also want to acknowledge the courage and the dignity of all of those who stand against domestic, family and sexual violence, who take action to challenge that violence, and who hold people who use violence accountable. And I want to acknowledge all the people and organisations who work tirelessly every day in the Northern Territory to prevent and to respond to the domestic, family and sexual violence. Their commitment, skill, experience and wisdom underpins work that is of core value to all of our communities. Domestic, family and sexual violence is overwhelming, but it's not an insurmountable problem. Every single expert says the same thing: domestic, family and sexual violence is preventable, it's not inevitable. And when it does occur, its impacts can be reduced. The evidence tells us that to prevent, reduce and ultimately end domestic, family and sexual violence, we must address its underlying drivers, the things that cause it. The drivers are gender inequality, rigid gender stereotypes, and for Aboriginal communities, the ongoing impacts of dispossession, poverty, colonisation and intergenerational trauma. There's been comprehensive research and work that's been done here in the Northern Territory, which the member for Guyula referred to, and it's publicly available. It tells us that the Northern Territory has the highest rates of domestic and family violence-related assault, sexual assault and homicide in Australia, that our rates and numbers are increasing year on year, that Aboriginal women make up the majority of victim survivors, the vast majority of people who are committing domestic, family and sexual violence are men, the largest number of reported offences are in the remote areas of the NT, followed by Alice Springs and Darwin, and the highest rates of reported domestic, family and sexual violence are seen in Tennant Creek, Katherine and Alice Springs. We know that less than 10% of domestic, family and sexual violence is ever reported to police. So although the rates are incredibly high, the actual prevalence rates are far higher. And while we all want to see the rates decrease, this is only going to happen in the long term. As the member for Guyula said, it may seem counterintuitive, but reported domestic, family and sexual violence will increase in the medium term as a result of improved responses and prevention efforts. I know that we're not sitting by and doing nothing. I know that we have high standard plans in place and experts who've worked tirelessly to address these issues and strong safety mechanisms. And I know we all genuinely want change, and I know there's a strong commitment across this chamber that we create that change together. But what are we missing? What else do we need? This is a complex problem and there's no quick fix. It's one of the most complex problems confronting our government and our community. I've listened to services and spoken to experts, and to me it's clear what we need to do. We need to increase prevention to stop violence before it starts. We need to build community understanding of domestic, family and sexual violence and shift attitudes and behaviours. We need to work with our children and educate them about safe, healthy and respectful relationships from their earliest years. We need more Aboriginal communities and strong elders to be supported to stand up against violence. We need to focus on men's violence. Stopping domestic, family and sexual violence is not possible without interventions with people who are using it. We need to expand men's behaviour change programs. We need men to step up. Men have an important role to play in challenging attitudes and behaviours that condone inequality and domestic, family and sexual violence. Stopping violence against women is not possible without men. We need more early intervention programs that work with young men who are starting to use violence, especially sexual violence, in their intimate relationships. We need to improve crisis accommodation, longer-term housing, counselling and support for victim survivors to reduce the impacts of domestic, family and sexual violence. And we need a strong system response that prioritises safety, respect, compassion and support for victim survivors, including children. We need more safe places for women and children to go, especially in remote communities, and we need more transitional and secure housing for victim survivors to rebuild their lives. We need healing programs for victim survivors. We need specialist responses to children who've seen and heard things that they never should have. We need to support our specialist services and our frontline responders who are faced with the most unimaginable scenes every day. They need training, support, retention systems, and we need to grow our skilled workforce. They need secure funding that keeps pace with the growing demand and not have to spend half their time fighting for their next funding agreement instead of focusing on their clients. We need much more resourcing, as we've heard, and it needs to be ongoing funding based on the actual need. We need this from both the Northern Territory and the Commonwealth. Services have told me that because of the lack of real indexation, their funding has been reduced in real terms by up to 20%. They've also told me that they get short-term one-off contracts rather than sustainable funding. This needs to stop. Drip feeding our services with stop-start trickles of funding does not work. We need to have a peak body for domestic, family and sexual violence services, and we need to support and grow the good things we already have. Things, once again, that we've heard about some of in this chamber. So the family safety framework in Alice, Darwin, Katherine, Yuendamu, Tennant and Nhulunbuy, where services come together to make risk management plans for victim survivors at serious risk. The risk assessment and management framework that guides all workers in a shared practice to help them work together, keep people who commit domestic, family and sexual violence in view, and keep victims, survivors safe using evidence-based tools. And our hard-working, stretched women's crisis services and men's behaviour change programs. We need to address harmful alcohol use. I want to be clear that on its own, alcohol does not cause violence, because violence occurs where alcohol is not involved and because many people consume alcohol but are never violent. However, across Australia, for both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, alcohol can weaken people's capacity for positive and respectful behaviour and can contribute to the likelihood and severity of violence. We need leadership, and that's what we're hearing in this room now, true long-term commitment to domestic, family and sexual violence, not to be treated as a party political issue. We need long-term investment across election cycles. This is especially important because domestic, family and sexual violence reform requires generational change. We need to listen to and respect the research and evidence, the specialist expertise and the lived experience from those who've courageously and generously shared their personal stories. We need to learn from the tragic stories of the women and children who have suffered and died in the Northern Territory as a result of domestic, family and sexual violence. We need a systematic domestic family violence death review process as other jurisdictions have. The evidence base for domestic, family and sexual violence reform is a fast-growing one, with new research being released every day. 5 years ago, no one knew what coercive control was, and now it's a household term, and this is helping women all over the world understand that just because he didn't hit you, it doesn't mean it's not domestic violence. And most importantly, as we're hearing in this chamber, we need to work together. A coordinated response is essential because of the serious risks of domestic, family and sexual violence, which may be exacerbated by a siloed approach. We need to do this together. Parties working together, government working across government, agency working with agency, sector with sector, service with service, because domestic, family and sexual violence brings people, children and families into contact with multiple parts of the service system, including domestic, family, sexual violence services, police, justice, housing, children and family services, child protection and health. If these systems work in a fragmented way, our work will be ineffective. And if we're not coordinated, we're creating more opportunities for victim survivors to be seriously injured or killed and for perpetrators to fall through the cracks. If we want to solve the crime problem in the Northern Territory, we need to pour everything into addressing domestic, family and sexual violence, because police report that 2/3 of the assaults in the Northern Territory are domestic and family violence related. If we want to solve homelessness, we need to address domestic, family, sexual violence, because this is the main reason women and children leave their homes and the most common reason for seeking assistance from homelessness services in the Northern Territory. If we want to reduce our prison numbers, we need to address this, because 2/3 of prisoners are held for domestic, family violence related offences. If we want to reduce the strain on our police officers, we need to address this, because police respond to over 100 domestic, family, sexual violence incidents every single day. If we want to stop youth crime, we need to address this, because domestic family violence is also a strong indicator for children entering the criminal justice system. And if we want to fix up our economy, we need to address this, because domestic family violence costs $21.7 billion in Australia every year. The cost of the domestic family sexual violence in the Northern Territory has been calculated at close to $600 million a year. These are the costs of our police, our prison systems, our courts, our hospitals, our child protection systems, which are spending most of their time responding to domestic, family and sexual violence. And if we want to close the gap, we need to address this, because it's the leading cause of Aboriginal children being placed in out-of-home care nationally. I'm heartened to hear the bipartisan commitment across this chamber to address this issue that does affect every single one of us. Every life is a universe. Every woman killed is a universe lost to her friends, her family and her community, and we cannot afford to ignore this. Thank you.
Any other speakers? Member for Nightcliff.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm extremely heartened to see this matter brought before the Parliament today, so thank you to the Leader of the Opposition and thank you to the Member for Johnson for the minute's silence. I take this opportunity to just briefly refer to, in my first speech, which I spoke about this issue. Throughout the election, if I ever heard mention of domestic family sexual violence, it was tacked on to the end, almost an afterthought. I said this many times before and I'll say it again. Domestic family sexual violence is the largest social issue we face, whether that's a motherhood statement or not. It is the largest aspect of crime. It is the largest driver of crime. Over 60% of all the men incarcerated in our prisons are there for domestic violence-related offences. We must look at all crime through the lens of DFSV. Women and children are being turned away from shelters every single day. Those frontline services have been crying out for adequate funding for decades from both sides of politics. I am an assault survivor and I will fully and relentlessly force the spotlight onto properly addressing this violence once and for all. The safety of my community is of the utmost importance to me. We are not safe as a community until everyone is safe. Over the past decade, as domestic family sexual violence has been discussed more and more, it has always frustrated me that the word men's was glaringly absent. The headlines were always about domestic violence or violence against women, like this violence is being committed by some faceless, nameless entity. And as the member for Gorges said, our words matter. If we can't name the problem, how are we ever going to fix it? And yes, I know that men are also victims of family violence, as are children, but the perpetrators who commit violence against women, boys and girls, and sometimes other men, those perpetrators are overwhelmingly men. So it brings me some sense of relief that as a society we are now at a place where we can name the problem properly. I'm finally seeing references to combating men's violence, although it's still not present enough in the reporting. I'd like to refer to the Assistant Commissioner Wurst's statements just recently after the death or alleged murder, I should say, of the Lajamano woman this week. What we're dealing with here, he says, is another tragedy for the Northern Territory, another tragedy for the community. The woman who passed away had a family. She had an extended family across the Warlpiri network. She had her own children. They do not have a mother now. It is something that the Northern Territory community needs to wake up to deal with and not accept, he said, end quote. The Northern Territory has Australia's highest number of domestic and family violence incidents, with intimate partner homicide rate 7 times the national average. And we know, as it's been spoken about, the majority of these women killed are Indigenous. It was good to see members today acknowledge that alcohol is an exacerbating factor of DFSV. Assistant Commissioner Wurst noted that the last 9 incidents had involved alcohol as a contributing factor in some way. This is why we so desperately need good alcohol policy in the Territory and why I implore the CLP government to not do away with minimum unit pricing. Reliable research has shown that the introduction of a floor price has resulted in 21% reduction in alcohol-involved domestic violence assaults. I contest the member for Fongling's interpretation of the Clifford et al. Study. They still state that the MUP minimum unit price was associated with reductions, and I'll be interested to investigate the modelling in their papers. But I do not have time to delve into that right now, although it's probably pertinent to point out that if you want us to pore over evidence, and I want to pore over the evidence, that it was your party that gave us a handful of days to consider this. That is not how good laws are made. I cannot tell you how many emergency department doctors and nurses have told me they are horrified by the CLP's intention to let people access cheaper alcohol. They deal with the consequences. If you're listening to Territory Voices, please listen to them. Domestic violence services here are crying out for needs-based funding. We have the highest DV rates in the country per capita by far, and population-based funding does not cut it. In September this year, we saw the Commonwealth announce $4.7 billion for frontline DV services nationwide. But as our population is about 1% of the nation's population, we only get peanuts. I have heard the Chief Minister and now the Minister for Domestic Violence speak about the importance of needs-based funding for the NT, and I'm very glad to hear that. I'm also glad to hear both the government and opposition acknowledge that this needs bipartisan support. I implore everyone here, and particularly the government, to make this your #1 priority. We've heard from the CLP ad nauseum about their response to crime in the Territory, but I cannot stress enough, domestic family and sexual violence is the largest aspect of crime, and along with poverty and the housing crisis, they are the largest drivers of crime. Addressing domestic family sexual violence, all facets of it, should be our number one priority if we want to make any dent in the Territory's crime problems. I want to end this by paying my respects to the women who have been murdered in my electorate, women killed by men known to them in domestic violence incidents. Every single one of them is a preventable tragedy. The most recent death in my electorate, who I won't name for cultural reasons, was in my suburb. In June this year, a woman who was a mother and emerging leader was killed by her previous partner in horrific circumstances, less than 50 metres over my back fence while I lay sleeping. Every time I look at her house, I think of her. I think of how this place has historically undervalued Aboriginal women's lives and deaths. I think of her family's pain and of her children's pain. And today I've been thinking about the bickering and cheap political point scoring in this place, and I hope like hell that this government and this Assembly can get its proverbial together to actually do something to prevent this happening to any other women. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Nycliffe. Any other speakers? Member for Daly.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Domestic family and sexual violence is a very dire issue which is continuing to have a terrible impact on families and communities across the Northern Territory. I want to firstly thank the Leader of the Opposition, bringing it to the attention of the Assembly for discussion this evening. Deputy Speaker, it is important that we have this conversation in a respectful manner and not politicise the issue of domestic family and sexual violence. We need to treat it with the seriousness it deserves. It is an issue that we as representatives of the Northern Territory and its electorates need to come together on and condemn strongly. I agree with the Leader of the Opposition. The statistics make for an incredibly distressing reading. We've seen too many stories in our news feeds over recent weeks, both nationally and here in the Northern Territory, describing the heartache and terror faced by families and communities impacted by the death of loved ones at the hands of someone they knew intimately. With such tight-knit communities such as ours here in the Northern Territory, we cannot go far enough without knowing someone who has, or at least has had a family member experience domestic violence. As my colleague, the member for Yingiya, said last week in this Assembly, domestic violence is real. It is a pandemic destroying lives, dividing communities, and holding back a better and brighter future. I want to extend my respects to the member for Yingiya and the family of his constituents who was lost to domestic violence last week. I also want to acknowledge the countless victims who have been lost to the terrible act of domestic violence. Deputy Speaker, domestic family sexual violence is a serious and life-threatening problem that crosses all ages, cultural, ethnic and socio-economic backgrounds. It is a blight on our society and has no place in our cities, regional centres or remote communities. No Territorian deserves to feel unsafe in their own home. We must do better, and I know we can do better. Deputy Speaker, reducing domestic family and sexual violence requires a united front and action from all parts of our society. This includes, from this Assembly, the Commonwealth and local government, our multicultural communities, sporting groups, Aboriginal community-controlled sector, faith-based communities and individuals alike. Domestic family and sexual violence should not be and cannot be a discussion relegated to the sidelines. It should always be front and centre. We also know that a shared awareness and understanding of domestic family and sexual violence is the first step in addressing the issue and puts us on the path to working together, sharing information and skills which are essential to combating this crisis. I would like to re-highlight for the urgency of this topic some points which the Leader of the Opposition made clear before. The Northern Territory currently has the highest rates of domestic family sexual violence in Australia. Since the year 2000, at least 90 women have been killed as a result of domestic violence in the Northern Territory. This includes 11 women being killed in horrific circumstances since June this year. Women and children experience a higher rate of domestic, family and sexual violence, and 9 out of 10 victims in the Northern Territory being Aboriginal women. Women in remote and regional communities are more likely to be hospitalised for domestic violence. Women from remote and regional communities also encounter greater barriers to reporting violence due to shame and stigma. Data often reflects only the cases of violence that have been reported to police and formal services, which means surveys could be skewed and not represent the full extent of the crisis we are currently facing. Violence perpetrated by close family members and intimate partners can incur long life trauma, affecting parenting and the well-being and development of children and young Territorians. The impact of domestic, family and sexual violence can lead young people to engage in criminal and antisocial behaviour and push them into the youth justice system. Deputy Speaker and members of the Assembly, domestic, family and sexual violence is claiming the lives of too many Northern Territory women. It is tearing our families and communities apart, and it must stop. While we know that this problem is complex and challenging, that is why we cannot shy away from it. Domestic, family and sexual violence is preventable, and with a concerted, collaborative and long-term effort, we can give every Territorian the fundamental right of living a life where they are safe, respected and free from violence. That is why we cannot leave this effort to just the words that are spoken here in the Assembly this evening. Deputy Speaker, words must be followed by action. This is why the former Labor government established the Safe, Respected and Free from Violence Reduction Framework in 2018. That is why the Territory Labor government invested $70 million in the 2024 budget to continue its commitment to generating change and safer communities for women and children, with an additional $30 million over 2 years to continue implementation of the second action plan under the reduction framework, supporting further health, justice and policing initiatives. That is why Territory Labor invested in the Men's Behaviour Change programs operating in Alice Springs and my electorate of Daly in Wadair, and funding for a future pilot program in Katherine. Because we know that in order to prevent domestic, family and sexual violence, we need to stop it before it starts. But we know there is so much more we can do, and we need to do. Today we've heard from the Leader of the Opposition, as we did last week from the member for Guyula, about a concentrated bipartisan approach to deal with this epidemic. The Opposition welcomed the CLP following the Territory Labor in its election commitment of $180 million to fully fund the second stage of the Domestic Violence Action Plan, and we call on the government to fast-track and roll out this funding as soon as possible. As the Leader of the Opposition outlined, we are here to support this rollout where we can. We want to also echo my colleagues' statements today that the Territory Labor Opposition stands here today with our hand open, reaching out across the aisle to work with the CLP government and members of the crossbench in addressing the major issue. We want to work with the Chief Minister and the Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence to secure a needs-based funding that is required from the Commonwealth and the Northern Territory to combat this prevalent issue that Territory women and children are currently facing. We need to put money into prevention, into early intervention and crisis response. We need to ensure that remote communities don't fall through the gap and miss out on the services they need to ensure that families, women and children can live in safe environments. Deputy Speaker, on a finishing note, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the magnificent work of the frontline service workers and advocates operating in the domestic, family and sexual violence sector. There are a number of organisations, legal services, safe houses across the Territory which deserve our praise. They do so much positive work in the face of what seems to be an insurmountable crisis. I say to them that we are here to support you and that we will do everything in our power as an opposition and as a collective assembly to make sure you receive the support that is needed. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
A little less than 2 minutes for this matter of public importance. Member for Arafura.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the House for allowing us to debate this matter of critical importance. Madam Speaker, reducing domestic violence is an issue that requires all of us to step up. And being from a remote community, I was surrounded by it at Milakarpati, and out of sight, out of mind type of situation there when I was younger, so it's close to my heart, this one. I want to work with every member of this Parliament on this, working together alongside the domestic violence sector, police, schools, Aboriginal and other community-controlled organisations. Also traditional owners and families, to turn the tide on what is a life of and death matter for too many Territory women. We need to work together to break that cycle of violence. We have some of the worst DV rates in the country. I can't say that I know everyone in this chamber and their history around it, but it is shameful that even without meeting everyone, I can say that it's more likely than not we have seen the devastating impact of DV on our communities. Children witnessing violence are more likely to become perpetrators or victims. Domestic violence affects entire communities, not just individuals. There is a generational history of failures through all governments.
Member for Arafura, you've run out of time.
You're right.
Can I suggest you complete your speech during the adjournment?
Yeah. Thank you.
So that concludes the debate on this matter of public importance.